Today we have a Glock 17 slide, which will be installing our Meprolight Hyperbright sights, this one being the yellow ring option, on a G19 slide, which has the Glock OEM polymer sights, which makes for an easy upgrade. And to install that, we're going to use our MGW Rangemaster tool here, which is nice because it utilizes this little shoe platform. And that shoe we're using today is specifically this shoe for Glocks. And the idea is it rides right on the rails of your slide. And you just want to make sure you have clearance for your rear sight to go through. So you just got to push it up a little bit. Make sure this sight is centered on the pusher. You want to tighten up the bottom knob on here so it essentially clamps down that slide into place. And yeah, you don't really use any kind of pressing material on the side of the slide, so you don't necessarily have to use any kind of painter's tape to protect your slide. It's already protected because it's only being held down by this shoe here, which is a pretty cool feature. So with Glock sights, we're going to be pushing off the right side of the slide and installing on the left. And we do that because Glock sights are tapered, and maybe you can see it right at the edge here. You can see that little taper, and the taper is on the left side, meaning you install on the right side of the slide, and then concurrently that means you take off any sight from left to right as well. So before we do that, make sure you set the depth of this whole upper part, and you see that white nylon piece way in the back. That depth is set by this little knob up here, which I've already preset. And you generally want to get as low as you can without scraping it, but not so low that you do scrape it. But where we are right now is it's about as close as you would want. And the lower you get, the easier it is to really push off sights. Otherwise, you're pressing pretty high and you start changing around how easy it is to press off the sights. You want to get as close to the dovetail as you can because that's where the tightness is happening on these sights. And then that's it. You just turn your knob or your screw on the far end. You press off your sights, and that's it. We're going to clean up our dovetail here on the sight, which you're just going to have to, unscrew these knobs, loosen this, take out your slide, just clean it up real quick, and then we're going to reinstall the slide itself back into the shoe, and then I'm going to install the sight itself. So we have our slide back in place. We have our sight started into the dovetail, and that's only by finger pressure. And generally the rule of thumb is you want the dovetailed portion of the sight, or the dovetail itself, to be a third of the way on to the slide with finger pressure before you start using mechanical force like a sight pusher. And that's generally where we are right now. We're about a third of the way on. So that rule of thumb is so that when you do use the sight pusher to press it, the 2/3 of the rest of the way on, you're generally exactly the tightness you need for a dovetailed sight to be, without really needing any kind of, additional way to keep it in place, like Loctite. Like generally, I don't use Loctite on my sights because most of the sights I press on are tight enough to begin with that they've never needed Loctite, they've never loosened up. But Loctite is definitely kind of a shooter's choice in that regard. I personally don't use it, but I know our instructions often say to use Loctite. And if you want to use Loctite, go for it. Whether it's the blue or the red, like how permanent do you want it, it's totally up to you. We've changed to the green Loctite, which is generally more for like slip fits, which a dovetail really is. It's not an actual thread, it's more a slip foot more than anything, which is why we do recommend the green Loctite. And so you can see how really tight this is, and there is just a hair bit of material that's coming off on the dovetail itself being pressed in, which is, you know, pretty tight to begin with, which is why I personally don't use Loctite. Just one more thing to clean up. But as I said, very much a user preference kind of thing. There's no right or wrong answer generally. And I'm just getting these lined up right now. And you can use a micrometer for this, but generally a person's eye, the human eye, is pretty good at spotting differences, whether it's aligned or not. And lighting does help. In this instance, I'm just checking from left to right. And we're pretty center there. You can always move it after, which is the nice thing about not having Loctite. You can always move it because there's no Loctite in there. And if you do use Loctite, it's generally about 24 hours for it to cure. So once it's cured, it's in place, and you're gonna have to break the seal of that Loctite. But when you're not using it, you can still move around that sight from left to right for windage adjustments. Could go a hair more. And that's where we'll stop. And then from here, we'll do the front sight. Now that our rear sight is installed, and you can see it there, it's going to have a subdued, if we can get it to focus, a subdued ring around. It's kind of like this blackish grayish ring, and it's got a U-notch specifically for the Glocks. There's only two Hyperbrights that don't have a U-notch, one being the CZ75 and the other being the Kimber K6. The rest of the 25 or so Hyperbrights all have that U-notch, and they all have green tritium both in the rear and front, no matter what the ring color is. So even though this is a yellow ring color, it still has green tritium vial within that ring. So that's the idea behind Hyperbrights. But moving on, we're going to do the front sight. So like I said, it's got the polymer OEM sight on there, which we're just going to take off. And we have a Glock front sight tool. This one is nice enough where the little pocket there for the hex screw is shallow, and it also has a magnet in the bottom. So I would highly recommend one of these that does have something shallow. There are a lot of these Glock tools that are pretty deep, and these screws, which aren't very deep, sometimes get stuck deep in there. So all you got to do is undo this. In the Glock OEMs, you can actually see the top of the screw because it goes all the way through the threaded portion. Comes out, there you go. It's retained by your magnet there. All this is just pulls out. It's like a little stud that goes into there. We just want to clean that out. We'll grab a Q-tip here. And this is a pretty new slide, so there's not much to clean up. And the screw size, at least on ours, is an M2.5. So for the newest generation of Hyperbrights that are coming out, the old ones were a M2 screw, so these might not necessarily fit. And these screws, the Glock OEM screw, is 100% longer. If we can get a side by side, than our Meprolight screws. So they're definitely not going to work. You're going to have to use the Meprolight screw, which does come included in the package, with our Hyperbright sights. So you just plop it in there. You want to retain this in place, and you can, what's nice about this tool is you can set it in place. There's still just enough of a tip out the top of it where you can get it started. And for this, you generally do want to use Loctite with the screws, and for these you do want to use like a blue or red. That is particularly for threads themselves. And here I have a blue 242, which is, I know there's all kinds of arguments out there about which Loctite is the best and which people prefer. But we have 242. Feel free to use what you want. Lots of right or wrong answers out there, as the crowd always says. You can use a lot and then wipe off the excess later. You just want to make sure your front sight is centered. Sometimes there is a tiny bit of play, and in here that is the case. Do you note that when you are tightening it, it's going to try to drive that sight because there's a little bit of play. So just be aware of that when you feel like you're done. And you don't want to over torque these things because I've seen them snap before. And once they snap, they sometimes snap deep into the front sight and they can't be extracted, and you're kind of SOL after that. Have some Loctite coming up, but we can clean that up. And we're getting pretty aligned there. That's all I'm trying to do here. Make sure it's not only snug, but aligned down the middle of the slide. You don't want it cockeyed either way, but it's naturally going to try to tilt that way because of the clockwise force coming from underneath. And then from here, all you want to do is just clean up all of the Loctite, which you generally don't want to use as much as I did. You don't need to overdo it, because then you have to clean up more from the bottom and top. Just make sure you get it all cleaned up, because once it cures, it's a pain to get off. Just be careful around solvents around these sites. They do shed it off, but you don't exactly want to keep these soaked in solvent. So that is it. We have our Hyperbrights installed, both front and rear. Hopefully that gives you a good idea of the sight picture there. It's not exactly full arm length, but there it is. Meprolight Hyperbrights with the yellow, and the yellow is phosphorescent. And let's see if we can give you a better idea. I can go turn the lights off quick. And you can see that front sight glow pretty well. And that is because of the phosphorescent nature of that ring. The yellow ring color is phosphorescent. in green will be as well soon, but not right now. You can see that rear sight. Camera doesn't pick it up too well, but the rear sight is green, despite what the camera is showing right now. And that ring color on the front is more of like a yellowish green, whereas the inside is definitely a green tritium. There you go.